This is CDA weekend, and so throughout the diocese, we're going to be beginning our Charity and Development Appeal. So that's an important part of the weekend. But before we get into that, there's going to be a video, and I'm going to speak a little bit about this. To those of you who don't know, I'm sure most of you are veterans of the Charity and Development Appeal. We do it every year. But I want to speak a little bit about the gospel, because this gospel from Luke chapter 6 is St. Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount. And it's quite different in many ways from St. Matthew's, which is the most famous one, which is the one we most commonly hear. But the one concept that underlies almost all of what Jesus is saying to the people as given to us through St. Luke is that there will be suffering. There will be suffering in this life. Now, that shouldn't come as a surprise to any of us. Thanks be to God, most of us don't suffer the basics. We have enough food to eat, and we have a shelter over our home, we have some clothes. Most of us here we don't suffer at those very basics, but the Lord even says, you will weep, or you will be persecuted. We could go on and on. The loneliness, the difficulties that happen in marriages that can create tremendous suffering, or the disappointment of your children, the disappointment of your parents, the ways in which we experience so many different varieties, hardship and difficulties. And that suffering, not just for us, but we can see it as extended out through the world, the amount of suffering that takes place everywhere. As I say, we have the basics. There are some people throughout the world, many people throughout the world, who go to bed hungry at night and don't have those basics. Tremendous suffering. So we ask ourselves, what is the meaning of all that? St. Augustine said that the problem of evil is perhaps the one valid objection to Christianity. Now, it doesn't mean that there isn't an answer for it, but it's probably the only question or interrogation against Christianity that is a difficult one to answer. And I was reading, years ago, I read Steve Jobs' biography by Walter Isaacson, and that was, at an early age, that was a thing that turned Steve Jobs against Christianity. Of course, there's probably some other things as well, but he said, I look at all the world and I can see all the evil, so there must not be a God. Well, for a 13-year-old, I'm not sure that's the best reasoning, but that's what happened. But there are many people who follow that track and say, if there is such a good God, an all-loving God, why doesn't he prevent that suffering? And if he can't prevent that suffering, that means he's not all-powerful. So there's an apparent conundrum there. And the only way to resolve that is by the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ. It's the only way. That's the only answer to why is there so much suffering. We know we begin with the premise, God does not send suffering. There is no suffering that comes from God directly. The suffering can come from human agency, people who inflict suffering on you. Suffering can come from the forces of nature or the fallen world, our bodies going into pathology. Suffering can be redemptive, or it can also, suffering can be the result of choices that we make that end up being bad choices. But God never says, I'm going to punish this person. I'm going to make this person suffer. Never does suffering come from God, but he does allow it. And there has to be a reason for it. And once again, I return to the cross. Because if we look at Jesus and we see that he sent his son and allowed him to die on the cross, the Son of God, knowing that that cross was not the last word, that he would be raised from the dead, and therefore his suffering had redemptive value. His suffering had meaning, not just a casual meaning. His suffering was the cause of the greatest victory in the world. And that's the paradigm. That's the way that we understand suffering to be. Suffering is for us a way to unite ourselves to the victory of the cross. St. Paul says, I rejoice in my sufferings because they make up what is lacking in the cross of Christ. That's Colossians 1:24. You could say, wait a minute, Father, what could possibly be lacking in the cross of Jesus? And it's because Jesus allows us to attach our suffering to his cross and therefore making it redemptive. And suffering can have that purpose to it. Oftentimes when I go and I pray with people who are very, very sick, going through very difficult times, they're really suffering in illness, that's when I ask them, I even give them specific things. Please offer your suffering up for this and this and this. Whatever else you want to too, but I'm going to get my list in there as well. Because your suffering is a powerful agent of the victory of the cross, uniting us to the victory of the cross. So suffering is not something, as many Americans believe, something to be avoided at all costs. No matter who you are, no matter how wealthy you are, no matter how psychologically strong you are, physically strong you are, suffering will come. It finds us all sooner or later. Just the question is, how do we experience it? And how are we going to frame it? And so the first one, as I mentioned, is allowing it to be attached to the cross of Jesus Christ. And then in his wonderful apostolic letter, The Meaning of Human Suffering, Pope St. John Paul the Great wrote that suffering also has another meaning, and he uses the Good Samaritan as the example. Because when we see people suffering, it's an opportunity for you and I to be of service to them and to help them and ameliorate that suffering by our generosity, our kindness, our love, and our care. And so this is not a plug for suffering. Nobody wants to suffer, but whether we want to or not, we will. And we will suffer. The question is, do we suffer and raise a clenched fist as if God were responsible for it? Or do we suffer and we say, Lord, I unite this to the cross of your Son because I know my suffering is meaningful and actually can bring about transformation in others because of the victory that your cross obtained for all of us. It's a great concept, and it's the foundation, really, of what we call the Paschal mystery. Okay, turn the corner here. Now we're going to talk about some other suffering, your money. So, Charity and Development Appeal. This is a wonderful diocesan-wide appeal that goes on every single year, and it serves over 70 different agencies and attends to the poor, the needy. You're going to see in the video all kinds of examples, but it is really a blessing, and it allows us here at Our Lady of Mount Carmel to participate in the larger diocesan work. We're Catholics. We don't limit ourselves to what happens in these walls. We belong to the diocese, the local church, which is the diocese, and then through the diocese, we belong to the universal church. And so when we serve, when we are generous in sharing our resources with the larger church, we're declaring our Catholicity in a very explicit way. So let's watch this video, and then I'll have a couple of comments to make on how you can respond.